It's July.
It is July.
And that means summer church at Westwinds. We're very excited about summer church. My name is Phil. I'm a teaching pastor at Westwinds. This is Corey. He's our lead pastor. And summer church at Westwinds is going to be very special this year for a few reasons. One reason is the book of James. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But let me tell you a few things first. This summer, as we're going through the book of James, we're using a guide called Common. It's a summer liturgy for Westwinds Church, and we want you all to have this. We want everyone to have one. And online, you can get it at westwinds.com/common. Westwinds.org. Westwinds.org.org/common.
Yeah.
And it's going to be very important because this is full of hymns we're going to be using. We're using some very old, ancient hymns and poetry. We did one this last Sunday, and Aaron said he shaved about 100 years off for us. It was written like in 1862. But the richness of the Christian heritage is going to be there. There's readings in here. There's things you'll want to use during the services, but also things that you can use on your own in your own meditation time. So we're very excited about this. So make sure you get a hold of one. Again, westwinds.org/common. Now, the book of James is what we're doing this year, but we're doing it much differently than a typical Bible study. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty excited about this because you've been getting me cranked about it. So why are you so excited about James in the summer?
Yeah, James is probably maybe the first book of the Bible that I really felt drawn to. You know, my family came to faith later in life, and I think I started reading the Bible a little bit in middle school, but probably more in high school. I didn't understand most of it, but I was trying to understand and trying to learn, and probably really just trying to do the things I was supposed to do as a firstborn kid. But I remember in high school reading the book of James and being like, I get this one. Like, this book makes sense to me, mostly because James is like so practical. Like, this book has just really, really practical advice. And quips. It doesn't really follow like a narrative that you really need to understand. The flow of it is it's like good advice after good advice after good advice.
Yeah.
It's almost like the book of Proverbs. Written in a different style, but same kind of concept where it's a little bit chunky, but it is, and why we're calling this season Common. It's like a book for the common people. It feels very human, very regular, and just full of things that make sense in our everyday lives.
And one of the great things about this is because the book doesn't have to be read in a linear fashion. We're not presenting it that way. Like, we're not doing week 1 is chapter 1, week 2 is chapter 2. Because we know for a number of reasons, but one is that in the summertime, not everybody's going to be able to catch every service, but that's the great thing about the common liturgy we have here, because even if you miss a week, you can still kind of review it, you can listen to it online, and you can immerse yourself in this book. And like you said, there's so many points to it that are so amazing as they stand alone, but then when you put it together, it's really powerful. And we're going to do something that is different, but I think it's pretty exciting, and that is that we're only in one service in the summer, a 10 o'clock service instead of our usual 2 services at 10 o'clock, but at 9:30 in our prayer room, and the prayer room is when you come in the front door of the building, it's the first door on the left. In our prayer room every Sunday for July and August at 9:30, we're going to read the book of James, the entire book. And it's only 5 chapters long, it takes about 20 minutes to read it, but we're going to listen to someone read it aloud. And kind of give us the rationale behind why we're doing it that way.
Yeah, so the book of James, like a lot of New Testament books, is written like a letter. But a lot of New Testament books are written to like a specific church, or even a couple churches that might be really connected to each other, but it's tended to be written towards like a really specific group of people. And the book of James, the book of James was written to be like passed around among churches, and so the way this would have first been experienced was still like in a primarily oral culture, and the book of James would have been probably delivered to the church, and someone in the gathering who could read would stand up and read the whole thing out loud for everyone to listen to. And so we thought, well, let's maybe try to capture some of that, and so we'll gather together, and someone in our community each week will stand up in the prayer room and read the entirety of the book of James out loud. But what I think is also interesting, again, because the book of James is not written like a narrative, but it's all these different parts. I think the more we listen to it, I think sometimes when we read things, we consume information one way. But I think when we listen to information, sometimes we can make different connections. And so I think it'll be interesting to sit and listen and then be able to make connections, maybe even within the book of James, or getting to the end and be like, oh, that kind of ties to something earlier in the letter. But then also in our own lives, that when we're listening to something, perhaps we just came out of a difficult week, or that week we had a tough interaction with someone in our life, or that week we, maybe we're grieving something, or maybe it was like a great week and we're really excited about life because James also speaks to rejoicing and happiness. Like James really captures a lot of human emotion. So I think uniquely hearing James read out loud will help us live out the book of James in our, as we say, common life, in our regular life with other people, the life in the dynamics of our life, right? So I think this is what I'm maybe most excited for. I'm not going to be a reader for any of the weeks, mostly because I want to come and just sit and listen to these weeks. I'm excited about this practice.
And I kind of see, so many times in Scripture, you'll read a passage and it hits you in a certain way. You'll read it again later, it'll hit you in a whole different way.
Yeah.
And I think, as I listen to it being read maybe on July 14th, on July 28th, I'll listen to it again, and maybe something that was said in one of the messages, or maybe something I read in the Common Book or something, and I'll say, oh man, I've heard the whole book a couple times now, but I didn't catch that. And so it'll be new. Now, the cool thing is we've been talking about the book of James, the book of James, the book of James. Let's talk about James.
Yeah. So James is interesting. So he's a little bit debated. So I will say this, like who is James? There are some scholars that debate this, and there's no way for us to know for sure who is James, who was James. But most of the evidence and most scholars would agree, or at least lean towards, that the author of James was James, the brother of Jesus. And which is, I think, a really cool take to be able to look at, because, in the early church, the way that people had authority, and I think too, like that word authority, we in our culture mostly know of like a top-down authority. In the early church, authority was it was like more like insight authority. It was
kind of like when this guy opens his mouth, we really want to listen to him.
That's right.
We really feel like he's got something to share with us.
And that's exactly it. Because these early churches were, their whole life was now disoriented, and they are navigating like new ways of worshiping and being together, but still connected to their like old religious practices. For the Jews, this wasn't like something other than Judaism, but a new extension of Judaism. And so what does this new movement look like? And the impetus was, what does it look like for us as a community to resemble the person of Jesus as a community? And so the people who had spent the most time with Jesus had the most, authority to give insights into what this looks like in everyday life. And so, again, coming back to James, James addresses a lot of the common struggles of just being human. And where some of the other books, they'll handle like some ecclesial things, like how do we do church together?
Yeah.
How do we worship together? How do we get along with each other kind of thing? James kind of gets below that. And, I like to think about James as having his hands in the dirt, and speaks to like the human reality. Like, how do we live this out in some of the less talked about parts of our life? How do we live this out, when things are going bad? How do we live this out when we are in a good place in life? How do we live this out when somebody has really hurt me? How do I live this out, when I don't understand, when I'm confused? Like, how do I how do I grow? How do we grow in, in wisdom and faith and patience, in the way of Jesus, in our common life? And so anyway, so I think that's where James had this really unique authority, because he was the brother of Jesus. I tend to agree with these scholars. It does seem like this is the brother of Jesus, which is probably why he could speak so clearly to some of these things.
Yeah.
But also why people cared what he had to say, right? People were like, this guy would have known Jesus like in a way that nobody else did.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think that's where James is.
I always think of, there's some evidence that one of the other New Testament writers spent 10 days with Peter, because Peter had been so close to Jesus. Paul, he came to faith later and he spent 10 days. And I always picture that as, Paul saying things like, tell me the way he looks. Tell me that,
Right, yeah.
And I think if you were sitting under the words of James, the brother of Jesus, you'd think, man, what is it about Jesus that made James so passionate when he said, we don't show favoritism with anybody.
Right. Right.
Well, James probably saw that again and again and again. And so I like reading the book of James and thinking, James didn't just get this handed down to him and taught by Jesus. He got it shown to him by Jesus.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's three words that we're centering in on that come out of the book of James. They are wisdom, faith, and practice.
Patience. You want me to hold that for you?
Yeah. Go across the room and hold that up for me. Wisdom, faith, and patience. Talk about that.
So one of the things that I often encourage people to do when they're reading the book of James, because James is so early in the book, he's really adamant about people incorporating his teachings, but he's really not saying his teachings, right? He's like incorporating the teachings of Jesus into their everyday life, that this is not ethereal, that Jesus-centered life is something we practice and do together. There's that word practice again.
There you go.
And so one of the practices that I encourage people to do at times, and there's actually a section of this, of our book to do this in, is to, before reading the book of James, is to sit down and do a brain dump. Have you ever done a brain dump before? Yeah. It's actually an old leadership tactic that sometimes before a really heavy meeting, we'll have people sit around a table and do a brain dump. But the idea is you just take out a blank piece of paper and a pen, and you try to write down everything that's going on inside of your head. And it's just like between you and the paper, so you don't have to tell anybody. But sometimes it's like things you're feeling and thinking. Sometimes it's like a grocery list. Sometimes it's something you're anxious about. Sometimes it's like your to-do list or what's on your calendar that day. But it's interesting if you just take 5 or 7 minutes, how many things are going on in our head at once if you'll allow your brain to do this work. But I encourage people to do a brain dump and then go to the book of James. Read through a section of James or a portion of James. And as you're reading, paying attention to the words of James, the advice of James, and then go back to that brain dump and identify inside of your brain dump what you might need to answer the things that are inside of that brain dump. Sometimes more wisdom, would address something in our brain dump. Sometimes a deeper faith would address something in our brain dump. And then sometimes what we need is just patience, right? That would address something in our brain dump. And it's amazing how when we go through a practice like this, how with the book of James, we can begin to make connections. Like, wait a minute, James actually speaks to this, item that I wrote down in my brain dump. Sometimes an item that was way back in our subconscious, it wasn't even, there's brain dump exercise sometimes pulls things out of our subconscious that are sitting back there, maybe causing anxiety or stress we don't even realize. And then the book of James addresses those things. And so James's book, you could do the same thing reading through James, that if you had one colored pen that you underlined everywhere where James is talking about something related to wisdom, a different color for every time James is talking about something related to faith, something else, a different color every time something related to patience. James kind of lives inside of these virtues in his book.
One of the things I like about that too is that, we hear wisdom, faith, and patience, and we tend to think, well, I know what those words mean.
Right.
And yet James takes them with a little twist and
right.
takes them a little deeper, so that like patience isn't just I can't remember my passcode. It's not that
Which
kind
is
of
probably
patience.
something he learned from his brother.
Yeah.
Because Jesus was always like using common language but meaning something totally different.
Really. Patience is a long-term kind of thing in
right.
James. I think the word endurance probably works better with that.
Probably,
way James uses it.
The way James uses it. Yeah, I think sometimes patience, we can think about like, having patience with someone who annoys us.
Yeah.
I don't like, I'm just going to put up with them or deal with them. James invites us into like a deep patience that helps us to endure in life. But endure, I think, towards faithfulness, right? It's not like I'm just going to like put this into a box in my psyche and pretend it doesn't exist, or just like deal with like this deal with a nagging injury. It takes patience. I think the kind of patience James is talking about relates to this like faithful endurance, where we're actually inside of the patience. Those maybe items in our life are shaping us and changing us too, right? And so James invites us to a really particular kind of patience.
And I think that really comes into, like you said about the brain dump, where you can kind of get these concepts from James of wisdom and patience and faith. And there's a depth to those words in James that meet us at really deep levels of our pain and our joy.
That's right.
And faith isn't to James isn't like, yeah, I accept that, and I'll say I believe that.
Yes.
No, faith is something about life.
That's right.
And
we learn. Really quickly reading James, you'll realize that faith for him is not ethereal. It's not like an idea, but it's really practical.
Yeah.
And
it's boots on the ground.
It's boots
stuff.
on the ground.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's orthopraxy. It's a praxis. Where sometimes we talk about faith like an orthodoxy, like having the right belief about something.
Up here.
For James, there's this interconnectedness between belief and action that are inseparable. They're very much tied to each other.
When he talks about wisdom, he's not talking about someone who knows a lot. They know a lot of scripture, although wise people many times do. Or he's not even just talking about like what we think of as sage wisdom, like we climbed to the top of the mountain and the guy with the long white beard. No. Wisdom, again, is something that really tracks with our lives.
Yes, right. Yes.
It's the wisdom that can bring kind of like this earthly brain dump together with God's intention for us. And that's when I read about the wisdom in James, it's like, wow, that gets me fired up. That's the way I want to live.
Which I think, again, ties back to Jesus. Like, this is what was so compelling about Jesus, is that he had wisdom like other rabbis and other teachers of the law. Like, throughout the scriptures, people are always talking about his ability to orate and share like knowledge. But they also were always talking about how he was just of the people, that, there was these quips about talking about how Jesus had like nowhere to lay his head at night, that he was just like among the common people, and that he ate with sinners, and like all of these quips that were passed around describing Jesus person to person were these ways of saying that like Jesus has the like accolades of other people that we would call wise, but he also lives among the people. And so James, I think, is advocating for this common wisdom that doesn't mean it doesn't mean it lacks knowledge, but the knowledge is rooted into the ground.
And that common wisdom sometimes goes against common sense.
That's
the way we define it.
Yep.
Because there's a depth to it that Jesus has a whole nother way for us.
Yes.
So when you think about Bible study, sometimes we think about people sitting around in a circle and just kind of over. No, we want to immerse ourselves here. Yes. So we will be sharing these segments during the 10 o'clock hour every Sunday.
Yep.
If you want to see the message in its entirety, the sermon that you're preaching, that'll be available after 6 o'clock online usually.
Yeah, so I think the idea is that this segment will air live at 10 a.m. online. And then the sermon will go live at 6 p.m. that evening. And so it's meant to kind of work like in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could watch this, beforehand. So if you're someone who is watching online, you could at 10 a.m. on Sunday watch this segment, which would give some other angles, precursors, extra depth to things that we can't include in the teaching on Sunday. And then at 6 p.m., turn around and watch the teaching that would it be in conversation with this, or vice versa.
Yeah.
That you could be with us in person on Sunday morning and then go home and watch this segment online that gives a little bit more depth. So again, we're living into this. We're trying to help our rhythm as a community kind of follow the rhythm of the book of James. That it's a whole bunch of pieces of faith and wisdom and patience, teachings on Jesus that live in connection to each other, but almost like a big ball of connection. Which isn't this life, right?
Yeah.
I wish my life was like point A to point B, A plus B equals C, whatever you want to call it. But really, it's like this whole big web of mess that comes together that we call life. And so we'll give it a try for the summer.
Yes, we will.
We'll see how it goes. We like trying things around here.
And if you can come at 10 o'clock on Sundays, bring a chair. There's shaded area. It's on the hill out behind the church. It's a natural little, almost like a natural amphitheater.
Yeah.
We'll be there. If the weather's terrible, we'll come inside. But we would invite you. But our online community is very important to us. We know some of you cannot come on Sundays, and that's why it's so important that we have this time together, and then the 6 o'clock when the regular sermon is available at 6 o'clock. So thanks very much for joining us today, and we hope you'll be with us all summer. And if you're traveling, you can get us anywhere. Thanks, man.
All right. Thank you. That's great. See y'all.